The year was 1881, and the heart of Pennsylvania was waking to a new age. Railroads were carving through the countryside like veins of iron, factories were roaring to life, and the electric light was slowly pushing back the night. But deep within Lancaster County, far from the smoke and the noise, there was a stretch of land where time had stopped, a valley hidden between two forested ridges, shrouded by mist and silence. No road led to it. No town claimed it. Locals called it Hollow Creek. To most, it was just a story, the kind that old farmers told by firelight when the wind howled. They'd say, "There's a place back in them woods where the clocks don't tick right, where the people don't age the same." But the truth behind Hollow Creek was stranger and darker than legend. In 1845, a man named Ezra Calder arrived in Lancaster County with a handful of followers, 15 in all, men and women who had once belonged to a small breakaway church in Philadelphia. Ezra was not old, barely 30, but he carried himself like a prophet. His gray eyes burned with conviction, and his voice had that rare gift that made people believe he'd spoken directly to God. He claimed the world outside was doomed, poisoned by greed, lust, and machinery. "The Lord has shown me a new Eden," he'd preach, "a place where the pure of heart will wait out the fall of man." When the towns rejected him, he led his followers north, through forest and marsh, until they came upon an isolated valley, untouched, fertile, and enclosed by two high ridges that sealed it from the world. There, they built wooden homes with their bare hands. They planted corn, wheat, and tobacco. They called their new world the Sanctuary of the Pure. Ezra wrote a book of laws called the Pure Law, commanding his people to live in total separation. They were to grow their own food, make their own clothes, and marry only within the faith. Outsiders were forbidden to enter. Outsiders were considered tainted by the serpent of industry. For the first few years it worked. They lived quietly, content in their isolation. But time, as it always does, began to rot what pride had built. By the 1860s, the Civil War raged across America, but in Hollow Creek not a single shot was heard. They knew nothing of Lincoln, or slavery, or freedom. They had sealed their borders so tightly that even the sound of progress could not enter. Children were born who never saw a town, never touched a book, never heard music that wasn't sung by weary hands at harvest time. Their world was no bigger than the ridges that surrounded them. The men wore long coats of coarse black cloth. The women covered their hair with bonnets and walked with eyes low to the ground. They looked to the rare traveler who might glimpse them from afar, like the Amish, but they were not. The Amish followed faith through humility and work. The pure ones, as Ezra's followers now called themselves, followed fear. The fear of contamination, of sin, of the outside world that Ezra had branded as the devil's playground. When Ezra died in 1859, his eldest son, Nathan Calder, took his place as elder. Nathan was harsher, colder, and far less forgiving. He believed that the world outside the valley had perished long ago, and he told his people that if they ever left Hollow Creek, their souls would burn to ash. By 1881, Hollow Creek was home to nearly 200 souls, all descended from the original 15. Their skin was pale, their eyes dull from malnutrition. Many of the children were frail, some born with twisted limbs or clouded minds. The elders said these were tests of purity, but the truth was simpler and crueler. Generations of inbreeding had taken its toll. The valley itself had grown eerie. No new houses were built, the wood was rotting. The crops were thinner each year, yet no one dared to change because change was the enemy. No newspapers ever reached them. No doctor ever came. No one left. At night, when the wind howled through the ridges, the people gathered in the old wooden chapel built by Ezra's hands. The floor creaked. The candles smoked, and Elder Nathan would thunder from the pulpit, "The outside is poison. The Lord sent the plague of knowledge to destroy the wicked. We are the last of the pure blood, chosen to endure until the cleansing is done." The congregation would bow their heads and repeat, "We are the pure. We do not see, we do not hear, we do not leave." And thus the valley slept for 36 years, hidden, untouched, and dying slowly in silence. Occasionally, someone from the outside world would stumble too close. A hunter, a lost traveler, or a government man surveying land for new rail lines. They'd see faint trails, maybe a glimpse of a figure in old-fashioned clothes. But before they could get close, the path would vanish into brush and fog. Some claimed that the people of Hollow Creek lived underground, that tunnels and cellars linked their homes like roots beneath the earth. Others swore the valley was cursed, that anyone who entered would lose their memory and wander in circles until they starved. Most locals stopped asking questions. Better to let sleeping ghosts lie, they said. But inside Hollow Creek, not everyone believed anymore. A new generation was growing up, children who, though uneducated, could feel that something was wrong. Among them was a young woman named Mara Calder, the great-granddaughter of Ezra himself. She watched the crops fail, the children sicken, and the elders grow crueler with every season. She heard her uncle Nathan thunder from the pulpit that the world outside had burned to ashes. But one night, while gathering herbs near the ridge, Mara saw something she had never seen before. A light, steady and white, moving across the horizon. It was a lantern, or maybe something brighter. And in that moment, for the first time in her life, she realized the truth. The world outside was still there. That tiny light, shining from beyond the valley, would one day become the spark that burned through 36 years of lies. Hollow Creek was a valley that time forgot, but it was not time that abandoned it. It was fear. Fear of progress, fear of difference, fear of losing control. And as history would later show, the greatest prisons are not made of stone or steel. They're made of beliefs that keep people from seeing the world as it truly is. Morning came slowly to Hollow Creek. The sun had to climb 2 steep ridges before its light could touch the valley floor, and by then, the dew had already soaked the earth. Inside the log houses, smoke curled from stone chimneys. The air smelled of wood ash and boiled grain. There were no roosters crowing, no laughter of children, only the sound of footsteps, quiet, measured and weary. This was a place where voices had grown thin over generations, where questions died before they reached a mouth, and dreams withered before they could bloom. The children of Hollow Creek were born into silence, not by nature, but by design. The pure ones, as the valley's people called themselves, lived under a single, unbreakable code written by their founder, Ezra Calder. The outside is poison. The word is law. Speak not of the world beyond the ridges, for it belongs to the serpent. That was the first verse every child learned. They learned it before they could walk, before they could write their own names. There were no schools in Hollow Creek, no books except the pure law. No one was allowed to read or teach anything else. Their elders said that reading the words of outsiders would rot the mind, that numbers led to greed, and that curiosity was the devil's whisper. And so, the children of Hollow Creek grew up blind to the world, their lives shaped by fear disguised as faith. Mornings began before dawn. Boys were sent to the fields with their fathers, their hands raw from picking corn and tobacco. Girls stayed with their mothers, learning to spin thread, bake bread, and wash clothes in cold water that stung their skin. They were taught to never look into mirrors, because vanity opens the door to sin. They were forbidden to sing anything except hymns, because music that pleases the flesh displeases the Lord. Even games were banned. There were no toys, no stories, no drawings scratched in the dirt. If a child was caught playing, they were made to kneel on salt and pray for forgiveness. In that valley, innocence was treated like rebellion. Yet, despite all this, children are born with light in them, and no darkness, no rule, can extinguish it completely. Among these children was Mara Calder, the great-granddaughter of Ezra himself. At 17, she was tall, with pale skin and dark hair tied back beneath a bonnet that never quite hid her curious eyes. Mara was different. She didn't know why, only that she felt things others didn't. When the wind came down the ridge, she would stand outside and close her eyes, imagining that it carried voices from beyond. When she saw birds fly over the valley, she wondered where they went, what land lay beyond the trees. Her questions made her dangerous. The elders said curiosity was the seed of corruption. Her uncle, Elder Nathan Calder, who now led the community, often warned her in front of others. The serpent spoke first to a woman, and through her, the world was lost. Be silent, Mara, before your thoughts poison us all. So Mara stayed silent, at least with her mouth. But her mind refused to obey. In Hollow Creek, knowledge was not just forbidden, it was feared. When a child was born sick or deformed, the elders said it was God's punishment for the sins of the heart. When crops failed, they said the valley was being tested for its faith. No one dared question it. They didn't understand that the sickness came from bloodlines that never mixed, from generations of marrying cousins and kin. They didn't know that their weak harvests came from exhausted soil that needed rest and rotation. The elders called it faith, but it was ignorance, the kind that kills slowly, generation after generation. Despite the silence, something was stirring among the younger ones. Mara's quiet rebellion began to spread, not through words, but through the simple act of noticing. A small group of children began to meet near the creek after dusk. They pretended to gather herbs, but what they really did was talk, softly, carefully, about things they weren't supposed to. One boy said he had seen a trail leading beyond the valley. Another swore he had heard the distant whistle of a train echoing through the hills. Mara told them to keep those thoughts safe, hidden deep in their hearts. One day, she whispered, the truth will come looking for us. For the first time, the children of Hollow Creek felt something that had been missing from their lives, hope. But in a place built on fear, even hope was a threat. One night, a girl named Hannah was caught drawing shapes in the dirt, a crude sketch of a bird. Her mother wept and turned her in, terrified that God would punish the family if she didn't. The elders dragged the child to the old chapel and locked her beneath it, in a hole they called the quiet cell. They said it was for reflection, but those who went in often came out hollow-eyed and trembling, if they came out at all. When Mara heard Hannah's cries echo through the wooden floorboards during worship, something inside her broke. She realized then that the only true sin in Hollow Creek was silence itself. After that night, Mara began to observe everything differently. The tired eyes of the mothers, the shaking hands of the elders, the limp of the boys who had never known rest. She saw fear not as holiness, but as a cage. She saw that obedience was not faith, it was control, and she began to dream of something unthinkable leaving the valley. When she spoke of it softly to the others, their faces went pale. To leave Hollow Creek was to die, they said. The air outside was poison. The ground would burn your feet. But Mara only smiled sadly. If that's true, she whispered, then I'd rather burn than stay cold forever. The children of Hollow Creek were not evil. They were not foolish. They were simply born into a world without truth, molded by hands that feared change more than death. Mara's questions didn't make her wicked. They made her alive, and in time, her courage to question would become the spark that set her people free. Because the greatest rebellion in any place of silence is not shouting, it's asking, why? Autumn had come early to Hollow Creek. The trees that lined the ridges burned with color, scarlet, gold, and rust. Leaves drifted down like slow embers, blanketing the worn paths between the cabins. To the people of the valley, it was another season of endurance. Harvest the corn, dry the beans, mend what could still be mended. But for Mara Calder, it was the season when the wind seemed to whisper more loudly from beyond the trees. Each evening she climbed the narrow trail behind her family's house, carrying a basket that looked empty but hid a secret. Bits of charcoal she used to sketch shapes in the dirt, birds, rivers, stars. No one else came this high. The elders forbade wandering near the ridges. They said the air thinned there, that demons lived in the fog. Mara came anyway. It was the only place she could think. One morning the wind brought something new, a faint rhythmic clanking, metallic and alien. It stopped, started again, and then vanished. She froze. No sound in Hollow Creek was ever metallic. Every tool here was wood or bone. Her heart raced. Was it thunder? Was it a test from God? She crept closer to the crest of the ridge, her bare feet pressing into the wet leaves. Through a break in the trees she saw movement. A man alone, bent over a small brass instrument that glinted in the sun. He was measuring something against the landscape, scribbling notes in a book. He wore a tan coat, boots polished with city shine, and his hat brim gleamed with rain. He looked utterly foreign, too straight, too clean, too free. Mara had never seen anyone like him. Her breath caught, fear and fascination warred inside her. Everything the elders had taught flashed through her mind. Outsiders bring disease, temptation, death. But the man didn't look evil. He looked curious like her. The stranger was James Holloway, a 32-year-old government surveyor mapping potential railway routes through the Appalachian foothills. He'd been following a stream when his compass needle began to behave oddly, spinning between north and west. That's when he'd stumbled upon the hidden valley below. No record of it on any map. As he worked, the woods around him went quiet. He sensed eyes watching. Then the silence broke. A twig snapped, light as breath. He turned and saw her. A girl standing half hidden behind a birch tree, bonnet pulled low, eyes bright with something between terror and wonder. For a second neither moved. Then she bolted down the slope. "Wait," he called instinctively, taking a few steps after her. "Miss, please, I won't harm you." But his shout echoed through the valley like a shot. Within moments, figures appeared between the trees, men in coarse black coats, carrying pitchforks and axes. They surrounded him before he could reach his bag. The leader, a tall man with a gray beard and steel-cold eyes, stepped forward. "You trespass on holy land," he said. His accent was rural Pennsylvania Dutch, his tone final. My apologies," Holloway stammered. "I'm a cartographer, a surveyor for the Commonwealth. I didn't know anyone lived here." The man's eyes narrowed. "Lies from the serpent. There is no Commonwealth, only ruin beyond these hills." Two of the men grabbed Holloway by the arms and marched him toward the valley. He caught glimpses of cabins, of women peering through shutters, of children hiding behind fences. Everything looked old, older than any settlement he'd ever mapped, like a ghost of the 1840s preserved in amber. They brought him to the chapel at the center of the valley. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and candle smoke. Elder Nathan Calder sat behind a rough-hewn table, the book of pure law before him. Mara stood in the corner, head bowed, but her eyes flickered with worry. "State your purpose," Nathan demanded. Holloway explained again who he was, showing his instruments, the compass, the brass theodolite, his survey map. He spoke calmly, clearly, with the authority of reason. Every word seemed to confuse the elders further. They murmured that his tools were witchcraft. Mara's uncle slammed his palm on the table. "Outsiders bring ruin. Your kind poisoned the earth with fire and smoke. You will leave before nightfall, or you will never leave at all." Holloway's jaw tightened. "I mean no harm. You live in a fine valley, but it's not on any state record. You have rights to this land. Did you know that?" The elder only glared. "Rights belong to the pure, not to those who crawl from the ashes of the old world." The meeting ended abruptly. They marched him back to the ridge, returning his bag, but not his compass. As they released him, Mara dared one glance toward him, a silent apology in her eyes. He gave a small nod, a gesture of understanding. That night, Mara couldn't sleep. The stranger's words looped in her mind. "You have rights, the state, the map." Each one felt like a door opening somewhere inside her. Before dawn, she slipped from her bed, wrapped in a gray shawl, and crept toward the ridge. Holloway had made camp a short distance from the valley, his small fire glowing faintly against the fog. He looked up when she approached, startled, then softened his expression. "You came. I shouldn't be here," she whispered. "They'll call it sin." He offered her a seat on a fallen log. "Then let's keep it short. You live in that valley. How long have your people been there?" "Since Ezra Calder led them. Before my grandmother's time." He said the world outside was destroyed. Holloway's face clouded. "It wasn't. The world changed, yes, but it's alive. Cities, schools, machines that run on steam. People aren't cursed. They're building things." Mara's eyes widened. Then the elders lied. "They were afraid," he said gently. "Fear keeps power. If they told the truth, people might leave." She looked toward the valley, tears forming. "So the outside isn't poison?" He shook his head. "The only poison is ignorance." Before she left, Holloway placed something in her hand. A small, tattered booklet, a school primer, used by his daughter back home. The pages held letters, drawings of animals, numbers. Simple things, but to Mara they were magic. "Keep it hidden," he said. "Learn what you can. One day." Someone will need to teach the rest. She nodded, tucking it beneath her shawl. For the first time in her life, she felt sunlight breaking through the fog inside her heart. When she returned to Hollow Creek, the dawn was just spilling over the ridge. In that light, the cabins looked less eternal and more fragile, like cages pretending to be homes. She knew then that nothing in the valley would ever look the same again. Sometimes a single meeting can undo generations of darkness. James Holloway didn't come to Hollow Creek to save anyone. He came to draw a map. But what he truly mapped that day was the boundary between fear and knowledge, between a world trapped in silence and one ready to speak. For Mara Calder, the stranger on the ridge was not a threat. He was proof that truth still existed, and that faith without understanding is only another kind of blindness. And though she walked back into the valley that morning, a part of her never returned. Winter pressed down on Hollow Creek like a weight of iron. The fields were bare, the creek frozen into a ribbon of dull glass, and smoke from the cabins rose straight into a colorless sky. For most of the valley's people, it was a season of endurance and obedience. For Mara Calder, it was the season when secrets began to breathe. Beneath the floorboards of her small cabin, wrapped in cloth, lay the most dangerous object in Hollow Creek, the little school primer that James Holloway had given her. Its pages were worn and smudged, filled with pictures of animals and letters she had begun to trace with shaking fingers: A for apple, B for bird, C for child. Each letter felt like a candle in the dark. At first, she read only by moonlight, whispering the words as though they were prayers. But as weeks passed, she began to share them with the children who trusted her. They met in the disused smokehouse at the edge of the Calder property, a low, soot-stained hut where the elders rarely went. There, they drew letters in the dust, shaped sounds with their mouths, and laughed, softly, nervously, as if joy itself were forbidden. Mara had never been a teacher before. Yet something inside her awakened when she saw a child's eyes light up after reading a word for the first time. It was as if the valley itself had taken its first breath in years. She told them stories, tiny ones she'd pieced together from the book and her imagination, about rivers that led to cities, about ships that floated on oceans, about people who spoke without fear. The children listened in wonder. To them, the world outside had always been a graveyard. Now they imagined it as a place of color and sound. They began to ask questions. Why can't we go beyond the ridges? Why did Elder Nathan say there are no cities? If God made the world, why did he give it to the serpent? Each question was a spark, and sparks, as history always proves, are what start fires. In small communities built on fear, secrets are heavy things. They bend the air until someone notices. By February, whispers began to reach the elders. They spoke of children meeting at night, of strange markings in the dirt that looked like letters. Some said they had heard laughter echoing near the smokehouse. Elder Nathan Calder, Mara's uncle, dismissed it at first. Children play, he said. They will learn obedience through hunger. But when he noticed his niece's distant eyes during prayer, the way her hands trembled when the pure law was read aloud, suspicion took root. One night he followed her. Through the snow he moved silently, his lantern dimmed. From the darkness he heard voices, soft, rhythmic, and then a child's laugh. He pushed open the smokehouse door. The lantern light spilled across the room. There they were, 7 children crouched around Mara, their hands black with soot, the forbidden book open before them. The children scattered like frightened birds. Mara rose slowly, the book clutched to her chest. She knew there was no escape now. Nathan's face was carved from fury. "What is this filth?" he demanded. "It's only words," she said, voice steady but low. "Words that teach, words that help." "Help," he thundered.
"You bring the serpent's poison into this house of the pure! You defy the law! You shame your blood!"
He snatched the book from her hands and tore at its cover, but something in her snapped. She stepped forward, her voice breaking years of silence.
"Uncle, it isn't poison! The world outside isn't dead!"
"There are people, good people, who build, who love, who live without fear. You've lied to us." The words echoed like gunfire through the wooden walls. Nathan struck her across the face.
"Silence!"
he roared. You will be cleansed before dawn." He dragged her toward the chapel, the book hanging in his other hand like proof of sin. The snow swallowed her footprints as neighbors watched from their doors, too afraid to intervene. Inside the chapel, the congregation gathered. Candles burned low, their flames wavered like uncertain hearts. Nathan placed the torn primer on the altar. "This woman," he declared, "has brought the tongue of the serpent among us. She has corrupted our young. She shall face purification." The people murmured prayers. Some wept quietly. Others turned away. They all knew what purification meant: confinement in the quiet cell until the sinner heard the voice of truth. Few ever returned the same. Mara looked out at the faces, mothers, children, men who had once called her kind. None met her gaze. Only one child, little Samuel, stepped forward, tears streaking his cheeks. "She was only teaching us to read," he whispered. "She said God made words." Nathan pushed him aside. "The devil also speaks." They bound Mara's hands and led her toward the cellar stairs. But fate often favors the brave. Before they could close the cellar door, a sound broke through the night. Not thunder, not wind, but the unmistakable creak of wagon wheels and the stomp of horses. Lanterns flickered outside the chapel windows. Nathan froze. The congregation gasped. Outsiders. The doors burst open. James Holloway stepped in, flanked by county deputies and a handful of townsmen. Snow swirled around their boots as they entered. The deputies held up official papers, stamped and sealed. "In the name of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania," one said, "this land is under investigation for unlawful detention and isolation of persons." Nathan's face turned white. "Blasphemy," he hissed. "The world beyond these hills is dead." Holloway's gaze met Mara's. She stood at the top of the cellar steps, her wrists bound but her eyes alive. "No," he said quietly. "It's very much alive." The deputies moved through the crowd, calming the terrified villagers, assuring them they would not be harmed. For the first time in decades, outsiders walked freely in Hollow Creek, and the sky above the valley no longer seemed so small. Mara was freed. The book returned to her trembling hands. The elders were questioned. The people were offered aid, food, and medicine. Many wept when they learned that the world beyond the ridges had never ended. Some refused to believe. Others simply fell to their knees in shock. Mara stood outside the chapel as dawn painted the snow gold. She looked at the horizon where the ridge met the sky and whispered a single sentence, the same one she would later carve above the door of her schoolhouse. Truth is the only law that cannot be broken. The breaking of the law was not a moment of destruction but of rebirth. One woman's defiance exposed decades of deceit and fear. She had broken man's law to honor something higher. The law of knowledge, of compassion, of truth. And in every generation since, there are those like Mara Calder who stand against silence, who risk everything to remind the world that obedience without understanding is the worst kind of prison. The valley had been kept pure by lies. She made it human again by asking why. The morning after the raid, Hollow Creek no longer felt like a secret place. Smoke rose from cold chimneys, doors hung half open, and a hush settled over the valley that had nothing to do with prayer. For the first time since 1845, sunlight reached the faces of the people without a preacher standing between them and the sky. Mara Calder stood outside the chapel where she had once been condemned. Her wrists were raw from the ropes, but her spirit burned brighter than the frost. The deputies and doctors from the county were moving carefully among the villagers, checking on the sick, handing out blankets, speaking in soft, patient tones. It was the sound of an entire world exhaling. Inside the chapel, James Holloway unfolded yellowed papers on the altar. They were the valley's first truth in half a century. Land deeds, census maps, and records of families who were supposed to have vanished during a smallpox scare in 1845. "You were never erased," he told the gathering of elders and townsfolk. "Your ancestors hid here to escape debt, disease, and war. But the war ended, and the world went on. You simply forgot to return." Some stared blankly, unwilling to believe. Others wept. The realization that their entire faith had been built on the fear of a century-old misunderstanding was too large to bear. Among the records, Holloway found a journal written by Ezra Calder, the valley's founder. The first pages were humble, a man seeking peace for his followers after the industrial panic of the 1840s. But as the years passed, the handwriting grew darker. "We cannot go back," Ezra had written. "They would mock us, tax us, make us slaves to the machine. Better to stay hidden and keep our blood pure." The last entry was dated 1862. By then, the Civil War had raged for a year. "If my people ever doubt, they must be reminded that the world outside is fire." The journal was read aloud to the community. Each line struck like a hammer. The elders' power crumbled not through violence, but through simple revelation. The truth was more dangerous than any gun. Mara watched as faces changed, anger, disbelief, sorrow. But beneath it all was a flicker of something new, curiosity. The same hunger that had driven her to the ridge months ago now stirred in every heart. For days the deputies stayed, ensuring no one went hungry and no one was harmed. When they finally left, Holloway remained behind at the people's request. He helped them set up correspondence with the county officials, explained what a school district was, and taught them how to sign their names. Mara became his translator between the old language and the new. Together they turned the chapel, once a prison of fear, into a hall of learning. The altar was moved aside, and in its place stood a long plank table with chalk, books, and lamps. The walls still smelled of candle smoke and penance, but the light that filled them now was warm and alive. The first lesson Holloway wrote on the board was simple: "Knowledge is not the enemy of faith." Mara read it aloud, slowly, letting each word settle like seed into fertile soil. The children came first, bright-eyed and fearless. Then came the mothers, then even a few men who had once threatened her life. They learned to write their names, to count, to draw the shape of the world they had been told was lost. For every word they learned, another lie fell away. But not all hearts opened easily. Elder Nathan Calder refused to enter the schoolhouse. He stayed in his cabin, muttering that the serpent had taken the valley. Some followed him, building small enclaves of silence. The deputies warned that division could turn violent again. Mara visited her uncle often. She brought food, sometimes just sat in the doorway, hoping he would look at her. "Why do you torment me with your pity?" he said one night. "You destroyed everything I built." She answered quietly, "Uncle, you built a cage. I only opened the door." For the first time his eyes softened. He did not forgive her, but he listened. And listening was the first step toward truth. By spring the valley had changed. The children no longer feared thunder. It was only the sound of distant trains. The women traded quilts for newspapers from the next town, and when travelers began arriving on horseback, the people of Hollow Creek greeted them not with pitchforks, but with curiosity. The state officials helped register the land properly. Hollow Creek appeared on the maps again, small black letters beside a blue thread of water. For the first time in generations, the valley was part of the world. During the first public gathering under the open sky, Mara stood before the people and read from the same journal that had once imprisoned them. "Ezra Calder feared the fire of the world," she said. "But fire does not only destroy, it also gives light." She closed the book and looked around at faces streaked with tears and smiles. "Our ancestors hid from the world to stay pure. We will walk into the world to stay alive." When Holloway finally prepared to leave, the valley came to see him off. His maps were complete, his heart heavier than he expected. He had come as a surveyor and was leaving as part of the story he'd uncovered. At the ridge where he had first met Mara, he turned to her. "The world will come here soon," he said. "Roads, letters, maybe even a railway. Are you ready?" She smiled, holding the primer close to her chest. "We were born ready. We just didn't know it." He tipped his hat and walked into the morning mist. Mara watched until he vanished, the echo of his boots fading like the last heartbeat of an old life. Years later, travelers passing through western Pennsylvania spoke of a valley where the people built a small library and a bell tower that rang every Sunday. Not for confession, but for learning. They said the woman who taught there refused to take payment, that her lessons were open to all. Her name was Mara Calder, and above the door of her schoolhouse were the words she had once whispered in chains: "Truth is the only law that cannot be broken." The revelation of Hollow Creek was not just about uncovering lies, It was about rediscovering humanity. The people learned that ignorance is not innocence, that faith without knowledge turns holy ground into a tomb. Mara's courage proved that the truth, once spoken, can never be buried again, and so the valley that had lived underground for almost 40 years rose into the sunlight. Not perfect, not pure, but real. It became a place where questions were sacred, where silence no longer ruled, and where one woman's defiance became every person's freedom. By the time the 20th century began to whisper its first inventions into the world, Hollow Creek no longer hid from maps or memory. The valley that had once buried itself beneath superstition now stood at the edge of progress, modest, green, and awake. The people who had feared the outside world were now sending their sons and daughters to it, armed not with pitchforks, but with pencils and ideas. At the center of this quiet revolution stood Mara Calder, now gray-haired and steady-eyed, known to everyone simply as Teacher Mara. Her schoolhouse, a simple wooden building with whitewashed walls and wildflowers growing at its steps, had become the heart of Hollow Creek. Each morning she rang the small bronze bell that once hung in the chapel's belfry. Its tone was the sound of freedom remembered. Where fear once ruled, gardens now thrived. Where the elders once preached isolation, villagers gathered for markets, debates, and storytelling nights. The old chapel was rebuilt as a hall of voices, its walls covered in murals painted by the children. One scene showed a ridge dividing night from day. On one side stood the frightened faces of the past, and on the other, figures walking into sunlight hand in hand. Mara watched those paintings every day and thought of the man who had first brought the truth to their valley. James Holloway. He had died years earlier in another town, but the map he drew still hung in her classroom. The students traced the ridges with their fingers and learned that they lived not at the world's edge, but right in the middle of it. Mara's lessons were simple reading, arithmetic, history, but woven through every subject was a moral she repeated like a psalm. The mind that learns is a lamp. If you hide it, the world grows darker. She taught children to question gently, to ask why even when answers trembled. Some of her former pupils left Hollow Creek to become doctors, teachers, and journalists. They returned with stories of trains that crossed mountains, machines that flew, and cities that glittered like constellations. Yet when they came home, they always found Mara at her desk, surrounded by chalk dust and the laughter of new students. One of them, Samuel Reed, the boy who had once defended her during her trial, became the valley's first mayor. He insisted that every meeting begin not with a prayer of obedience, but with a reading from the Book of Learning, a collection of notes, essays, and sayings copied from Mara's teachings. In the corner of the village cemetery stood a single gravestone older than the rest. Nathan Calder, 1899–1899. It faced the ridge where he had once tried to bury the world. Mara visited often, laying a sprig of wild thyme upon the stone. During his final years, her uncle had softened. He never renounced his faith, but he admitted his fear. "You were right, child," he had whispered to her once. "The world was not fire. It was light I did not understand." She forgave him before the words had even left his mouth. That forgiveness became part of the valley's character. Hollow Creek did not erase its past, it learned from it. The people kept the old hymn melodies, but they rewrote the words. They sang not of walls and purity, but of roads and courage. In 1903, the whistle of a train echoed through the valley for the first time. Iron rails curved down from the ridge like veins carrying lifeblood. The villagers gathered to watch as the black engine steamed into view, its wheels hissing, its steel bright in the afternoon sun. Mara stood near the tracks, tears glinting on her cheeks. For 40 years she had taught her students that connection, not isolation, was strength. Now she saw it written in iron. When the conductor stepped down, he tipped his hat. Hollow Creek, he read from his manifest. Didn't know this place existed. Mara smiled. For a long time, neither did we. As her years grew short, Mara began to write, not sermons or memoirs, but letters to the future. In them she described the valley's journey from darkness to dawn, and the lesson she wanted every child, every nation, to remember. Ignorance is a seed that grows wherever truth is silent. Speak truth kindly, and even stone will bloom. She sealed the letters in a wooden chest beneath the schoolhouse floorboards, knowing that someday another generation would find them when the world again forgot how fragile light can be. The night she died, a storm rolled across the mountains. Her students, now adults with families of their own, gathered in the schoolhouse and kept the lamps burning until dawn. They said the thunder sounded like her bell ringing one last time. By mid-century, Hollow Creek had become a thriving township. Its population had tripled, its people known across Pennsylvania for their craftsmanship, literacy, and compassion. The original schoolhouse still stood, though larger now, with brick walls and wide windows. Above its doorway hung the same hand-carved sign, "Truth is the only law that cannot be broken." Every year, on the anniversary of Mara Calder's first lesson, the townspeople held a festival of light. They lit lanterns along the ridge path she once climbed and told stories of the woman who had turned fear into wisdom. No one spoke of devils or purity anymore. They spoke of courage. Children recited her sayings by heart. When you ask why you honor God, they'd chant. When you listen, you find truth. In 1965, the state recognized Hollow Creek as a historical site. Scholars and tourists arrived to study the strange little community that had hidden underground for 40 years and emerged as a beacon of education. The old chapel, where once torches had flickered over chains, became the Museum of the Valley of Truth. Inside, under glass, lay the weathered primer that started it all. Its pages were fragile, its drawings faded, but one could still read the childlike letters: A for apple, B for bird. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Gifted to Mara Calder by James Holloway, 1881. Proof that a single book can change a world." Visitors often left in silence, carrying something heavy and beautiful in their hearts, the realization that history's greatest revolutions begin not with weapons, but with questions. The legacy of Hollow Creek was not its survival, it was its transformation. It taught that ignorance is not inherited. It is taught, and therefore can be unlearned. It proved that faith and reason need not be enemies, that love and truth can share the same prayer. Through Mara Calder's courage, a hidden valley became a mirror for the world, a reminder that darkness is not destroyed by force, but by a single, steady light that refuses to go out. And somewhere, high on the ridge where it all began, the wind still carries her voice. Soft, certain, eternal, seek the truth, even when it costs you comfort. Speak it, even when it breaks the law. For every truth spoken aloud is another dawn for the world.